On September the 11th, 2001, like most people around the country and like many people around the world, my eyes were focused on the television, on the attacks, and the eventual collapse of the Twin Towers. My colleagues and I, as researchers at the University of Delaware's Disaster Research Center, were also simultaneously focused on what we can learn. My colleague Jim Kendra and I went to New York City 2 days after the attacks, and we spent much of the next 2 months observing response activities, shadowing logistics personnel, and also spending time in the Emergency Operations Center. We went back to New York City the following year and conducted in-depth interviews, and we learned so much. One of the things that we discovered was that while we were looking upward towards the burning towers and then down towards ground zero, something remarkable had taken place on September 11th along the water's edge. Imagine a flotilla of ad hoc vessels evacuating 500,000 people from Manhattan. Dinner cruise vessels, ferry boats, tugboats, all coming together to get people out of harm's way. Imagine that flotilla evolving to ferry supplies and personnel back to Manhattan on their return trips to pick up more people, serving as respite centers for responders, helping with the fire suppression. That's impressive enough. But now imagine if there was absolutely no plan for this to take place. That the improvisation occurred in the midst of crisis by people who kept saying to themselves that they just had to do what they had to do. That's extraordinary, and that's exactly what happened. People began moving up towards Midtown, walking north, eventually making their way by foot across the Brooklyn Bridge. Some people, however, ended up walking south or were trapped in an island without an escape by rail or subway, by car or by bus. They walked to the waterfront. Some of them were covered in dust. Many of them were shaken. But what they found were vessels to transport them to Staten Island and to Brooklyn, to Weehawken and Liberty Landing, New Jersey, and further south to the Atlantic Highlands. It was as if we were standing on the moon, one respondent said. Everything was quiet. The boats were covered with dust. It was as if we were in a haunted movie. These mariners didn't know what they would do when they got there. They just started doing, beginning what they would later describe to us as an American Dunkirk-style evacuation. So, how did they actually improvise themselves? How did they figure out what they were going to do? Well, there were a lot of aspects, but one thing was key: their identity. Captain Pamela Hepburn, she found her way to the boat evacuation saying, "There's nothing that I can do but the boat thing. I can't do anything else." Well, I'm sure there's lots of things that she could have done. She could have handed out water. She could have provided some first aid. She could have given comfort to people nearby. But she was a boat captain, and she imagined her role through that identity. There was former firefighter and freelance mechanic Tim Ivory. He was chief engineer of the John J. Harvey. This was a retired fireboat that had been purchased and restored by a group of friends who just were looking for something to do a few years prior. Originally, the Harvey set out to participate in the boat evacuation, but a fire department official saw it out there on the river, and he was able to imagine a more urgent task for that boat. So, with fellow crew members, Tim Ivory worked to improvise and rig the Harvey to pump water from the river into ground zero after the fire suppression infrastructure had been destroyed. The tugboat operators, they saw themselves as people who tackled trouble. And what they found unfolding before their eyes on 9/11 was certainly trouble. Some ferried people out of harm's way. Others, like Ken Peterson, who had experience in incident management, jumped ship, so to speak, grabbing radios, going up to the lines, trying to organize them, dispatching boats on the shoreline. Initially, people just got on a boat wherever it was going, not necessarily where they lived, not necessarily where they could get help. They began to develop a system along the shore. We even heard about a bartender on Pier 63. He would walk the line of people who were waiting to catch a boat to New Jersey, giving them something to drink, giving them some chips, offering some comforting words. What do we think of when we think of a bartender? Someone to get us a drink, someone to make us feel welcomed. He saw a need that others didn't necessarily see. He saw a way through his identity that he could step in and help. In the emergency management community, there's a great deal of discussion about command and control. Perhaps some of that was reinforced after 9/11 as a takeaway. But what was great about the Coast Guard and what made this response work was that the Coast Guard didn't take a command and control approach. Instead, they coordinated some activities, and then they watched and allowed others to unfold. They recognized the value of the citizens around them, the knowledge and the skills that they were bringing to the table, and they allowed them to define for themselves what needed to be done. There are many misconceptions about disasters, and sometimes these lead us to be somewhat skeptical of a community response. Disaster movies tell us that people are going to suddenly start engaging in mass panic or mass looting. In reality, we know from the research that this isn't typically what happens, but it can leave people with a certain amount of distrust, and it can lead some officials to distrust the public. What we do know about disasters is that people step up and that people can really contribute. And what was indeed made successful in the boat evacuation was the fact that the Coast Guard and the harbor pilots and the police, the harbor police, decided not to control what was going on, but instead to value the participation and the improvised citizen response to a terrorist attack. Now, did any of these citizens end up breaking any rules? Certainly. For example, initially, there was a lot of overloading of the vessels, somewhat dangerously so. But it didn't take long for the boat captains to pause, take a breath, talk to each other, and say, you know what? We got to slow down. We got to think about this. So, did they begin, or did they continue to exceed the capacities? Yes. But they were counting people as they came on. They knew the capacities of their vessels, the safety of numbers. Many of them actually sat them down and gave safety training before departing the shoreline across the river. We heard examples of people destroying property, tearing down fences, but again, safety was key. They wanted to allow people better access to the boats that were coming to pick them up, to make sure they didn't trip over the fences. We even heard one example of a gentleman who had asked several police officers to please turn the other way because he and his friend were about to liberate a golf cart, hot wiring it in order to use it to bring supplies from the waterfront operation over to Ground Zero. Understand in that situation, he still deliberated. He still checked. He checked with the officers to make sure that this was okay in that environment. Now, was this just civilians? No. We talked to a Coast Guard official, for example, who said that he thought that he had broken more rules that day, in that single day, than he had enforced over his entire career. Now, that's probably an exaggeration, but we get the point. He described what I like to call the Mike Wallace barometer. He said that as he was making these decisions, he began thinking, well, what if I was on 60 Minutes? What if I had to defend this decision of imposing an obstacle on the response or allowing something to happen even though it broke the rules? Would I be comfortable talking to Mike Wallace and saying, yes, I did it. Here's why, and I'm okay with it. And if he could do that, then he could move on to the next task, believing that he had made the right decision. At the same time, he had someone with him, purposely, someone who he felt could speak truth to power, someone he felt would say, hang on a minute, that might be a misstep. Maybe we need to rethink it. So one of the things that we found with the improvisations that broke rules, they involved three things, whether they were the mariners, the civilians, or officials. The individuals were thoughtful. They thought about it. Is this the right thing to do? They also really adhered to the spirit or the purpose of the rule. Oftentimes, this was about safety. And third, they did it in deliberation with others. They talked to other people. Planning is essential in emergency management. We want to be sure that emergency managers understand the mandate to think ahead, and most often they do. But in the movement towards this idea of commanding and controlling, and thinking that we might be able to grasp all the aspects of a major disaster, we sometimes forget the importance of improvisation alongside planning. We think that we can manage it. We think that maybe improvisation won't be necessary. And one of the things that was excellent about the Coast Guard is that it really valued that improvisation. It understood that it played an important role. And in fact, by involving these citizens who had skills and knowledge and knew their local environment, by allowing them to participate and not stepping away, the response was actually better off for it. So, does that mean that we don't plan? Does that mean that we don't outline tasks? Of course not. Planning and improvisation go hand in hand. There are certainly things that we can anticipate and should anticipate ahead of time. But that planning will allow for the relationships to grow that foster improvisation. That planning will allow the time and the space to deal with the things that we didn't anticipate, or to deal with the things that we can't control. It'll allow us that time to really respond to the disaster. Disasters aren't a static thing or a static place. In fact, the shape of disasters is constantly changing and resisting the firmly scripted plans and procedures that we might assume will work. Instead, we really need to think about how we can incorporate both and bolster both. When we think about any effective disaster response, it really involves the ordinary achieving the extraordinary. And that was especially true in the waterborne evacuation. It happened with a tremendous amount of success. But we also have to understand that people do not respond to an immense disaster. What ended up happening was that they tackled these issues in bite-sized chunks. They looked for what was in their wheelhouse and what they could do. When we think about it, people actually have much more capacity than they think they do. When we think about all the different ways that our citizens and our community members can contribute, to be able to look and see what their root strengths are, be it as mariners or as farmers, be it as welders or educators, be it as cyclists or gardeners or Little League coaches, there's so many ways that we can contribute. And the thing about disasters is because they affect the entire community, that gives an option for practically everyone to help. And this is the lesson that we should be inspired by. Thank you.